Good afternoon, all. My name is Sophie Hooper, IWFM's Head of Policy and Research, and I will be your host for today's webinar, which is brought to you in partnership with Carbon Numbers. We are also joined by a great panel who I will introduce shortly. Now, the aim of today is to introduce our new Energy Management GPG, which provides guidance on the best policy and strategy to pursue for managing energy consumption within your organization. It covers the mechanisms associated with data capture, identification, and implementation of efficiency measures based on the energy hierarchy, together with the engagement strategies needed to achieve the desired outcomes and impact. And that is against the backdrop of climate change and ongoing volatile energy prices. It also includes some common issues and lessons learned. And Sunil will talk about that a little bit later. Our 2023 Sustainability Survey report, published in February, shows that managing energy efficiencies and optimizing workplace use is the #1 opportunity for FMs to add value in their organizations in relation to drawing up and actioning energy efficiency net zero action plans. Yet we also know that only 13% of FMs lead on those net zero plans. This guidance is therefore much needed so that our members can lead and deliver on the impact they should and can make. And many discussions that no doubt people will have is that without FMs, net zero will not be achieved because the operational energy is the bit where the gap often is. Now, circling back to the issue of energy price volatility, this is likely to be the new normal, which means that the overall approach to energy management needs to be much more strategic, with energy price risks being treated similarly to other business risks, in addition to have major consequences for future valuation of the building. And I'm sure we will touch on some of this in our conversation with the panel. Now, the running order of this session is that Sunil, the technical author of our newly launched GPG, will briefly present the new guidance, after which he will be joined by Laura and Neil to discuss the key challenges and opportunities in that panel discussion. And I would really like to encourage you, the audience, to ask questions throughout the session. We will pick them up and discuss them after the presentation. So please, all the way through, just put them in there. Can you put them, please, in the Q&A box, not the chat? And like all platforms, you are able to ask your question anonymously if you would prefer to do so. Now, Sunil, Neil, and Laura, welcome. May I please ask you to introduce yourself? And Sunil, can I start with you, please?
Yeah. Thank you, Sophie. So my name's Sunil Shah. I'm the Managing Director of the SFMI, the Sustainable Facilities Management Index, and Cloud Advisory, and I'll give a more detailed introduction in my presentation.
Neil?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Sophie. Neil Fry. I'm the Chief Executive of Carbon Numbers. We're the sponsors of the paper. We principally work with facilities managers. I'm also a fellow of the Institute, and we saw this as a very important piece of work, and we're very excited to see it shared with you.
Thank you. Laura?
Hi, I'm Laura. I'm Innovation Lead in the Net Zero Heat team at Innovate UK. We're working to get all buildings off gas, as well as supporting the UK economy. I was previously at the Building Performance Network, where we were promoting the use of building performance evaluation. I'm sure we're going to talk about why that's useful. And I've brought that enthusiasm for data to Innovate UK, where we're supporting organisations developing the use of data to improve our built environment.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Sunil, the floor is yours.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. So the Good Practice Guide is on your screen at the minute, so you can download it using QR code, or it's also available from the website as well. As mentioned, just a quick bit of background to myself and also where I've come from. So it's around 25 odd years working within the built environment, director level with Johnson Controls, Jacobs, and also Planning Practice DPP, but also heavily involved with both the IWFM chairing the Sustainability SIG, but also with government bodies over the time as well. So we've just had an interesting chat, Laura and I, about some of the challenges that we've had over the last 20 years or so, where a huge amount has changed in the way that we manage and deliver properties, but also not much has changed either, in that we're still waiting for guidance and a standard definition of what we mean by net zero over that time as well. I've also been heavily involved with some of the other programs, such as Carbon Buzz, which was run with a number of professional institutes, and a knowledge transfer program called CBX, which involved various actors through the building life cycle. And part of that was where I was also involved with the building performance evaluation, which was provided and produced by Innovate UK. And that came from a number of years of investigation of buildings, their performance through the design, and then into the operational phase as well, to learn lessons about how can we enable buildings to deliver aligned with what they should be doing, and reaching back into the design phase to enable that to happen. So a lot of that knowledge and information has been fed into this energy management guide. So principally, the purpose of this guide is for facilities managers to look at their role of being able to reduce costs to ensure compliance is met, but also to be able to deliver on what the customer demands are as well. So what this guide isn't intended to do is to replicate the many other guides that are there, but very much focused towards the facilities manager isn't likely to be an expert in all of these fields, but they do have a responsibility for coordinating that knowledge and ensuring delivery of a functional and best practice building. So it's in line with that role that this guide has been developed. So it does look at elements about how do we ensure that the data that's captured is correct, and how do we use that data to be able to influence and inform decision making within the organisation, and decision making through the various stakeholders and senior managers. Typically, from an energy management perspective, we look at two key things. One is how do we pay less energy per unit? And the other one is how do we reduce energy consumption overall? And it's this second part that the guide does focus upon. So we're not necessarily looking at the procurement elements of energy management, but very much how do we understand the data and how do we enable reduced consumption taking place. And Saif has mentioned at the beginning, there's a number of challenges and changes which are starting to take place, which will affect energy consumption, but also energy costs as well. So there is an increase in regulatory drive around disclosure. We have already in place regulations like the Simplified Energy and Carbon Reporting Standards, the SECR. We're currently in the ESOS phase, the Energy Saving Opportunities Scheme, but we'll also be getting new regulations called the Sustainability Disclosure Standards later on, which will require much greater levels of disclosure, and the responsibility of that disclosure sits with the director level to ensure accuracy of the data. So that's a role where FMs again now have a direct line of sight to talk about not only the numbers, but also what they mean and a business case around how to be able to reduce them. So that means the data and the accuracy of that data becomes more important. There is liabilities that are held then at an organisational level for poor quality information being provided. We also have the cost pressures coming through, and the prices aren't going to go back to where they were 5-6 years ago. So we will have an increased cost that comes through, but also the corporate net zero standards, the move away from gas and moving towards electrification of the heating system means that we need to use that data for informed decision making, which is reaching out 10, 15, 20 years ahead. So the decisions that we make today about whether we choose a boiler or not a boiler will be the same equipment that is likely to be in place coming up towards 2050. So any net zero targets, which starts talking about net zero standards in the next 10, 15 years, will also start talking about some of these plant changes. And that's where, again, some of these life cycle elements are built in, but also they are inherited as well. So the delivery of a building in its operational stage will also include a number of other actors that are involved in the decisions that have come about with how the building operates. The longer that a building exists, the greater the number of changes that are likely to have taken place in terms of refurbishments and upgrades and changes to things like heating and cooling systems within the building as well. So all of that adds an influencing factor in terms of how to optimize the building, but initially it's also understanding how is the building to be managed and maintained. Was it designed as an open plan or as a cellular space, which will then influence what you can actually achieve and do within that space. So data, I've mentioned a few times, data isn't about collecting as much data as possible. So we don't need to meter everything. It is very much a case of understanding what value does the data provide. So already we do capture within building management systems and within various other portals and platforms a huge amount of data about the running of the building. But a key part of that is that data correct? Are we reading the correct things from building management systems and various other outputs that we've got? So data overload can become a negative. We tend to get drawn into the mass of the data and the information and fail to see some of the key information. So a lot of it is about how do we ensure that at a starting point we identify what is key and correct data, and then make sure that that part of it is correct. And so simply we're starting to ask the questions of, we understand about how much energy comes through. We might correlate that back from meter reads to the invoicing as well. But if we start to look at a bottom-up approach, say how is the energy being used, there may be a gap that exists. So a key and critical part of the exercise is around how do we understand where that gap arises and what's consuming the energy that leaves that gap. So that data point then becomes quite a critical part of what we're looking at. The sub-metering that we have only then tells us part of the story that's in place. And so the data and the data quality can come from a huge number of different places that exists. So whether it's part of the regulatory systems, whether it's part of utilities, whether it's part of knowledge or industry standards. And they all have pros and cons that attach to them. So utility bills, everybody has the utility bills that are paying the energy. They are accessible, they do give you a good story, but sometimes they're estimated, sometimes the granularity in there isn't as good as it can be. We have half-hour metering that comes through. So for those with meters and consumption above a certain threshold, again, very good data that can be provided. The granularity, every half an hour you've got a pulsed output telling you how much energy is being used. But it's a huge amount of data, and it does need to come with the context of how the energy is being used, and it doesn't necessarily split out in terms of the end use ideals. We can also start to look at energy performance certificates as well, regulated activities for all leased buildings, but again, doesn't necessarily provide us with some of the underlying granularity. So each of these have slightly different benefits in terms of the data they provide. So part of the exercise is about understanding what's going to be the correct data that we need to have and how will it help us to deliver the objectives that we want to achieve. So where do we go from here? We've got the data, we've got the information, we've got an understanding of the accuracy of the data as well. So the next stage is around performing an audit. And there's a huge amount of information that's been written on audits. The ESOS regulatory standards talks in great detail about the standards for audits, and CIBSE also has got a huge amount of information. Guide F talks as well a lot about how audits can and should be performed as well. So again, reach out to those companion documents for further details. But the initial starting point is about understanding what you want to achieve as well from the audits. So that then focuses upon the key areas that you also want to investigate within your building. So part of looking at the data and the numbers will help to inform where you have certain leakages, excess consumption, and that's where your focus then turns towards. So a mechanism that is used, and one that I would also promote heavily, is a post-occupancy evaluation. There's a number of different types and ways of how post-occupancy evaluations are performed. This is the model that we use, which is flexible and changeable. So the bottom 4 starts to talk about the kind of outputs that is sought. So that can vary from cost savings, user satisfaction that's improved within specific buildings. It can be looking at a few buildings and rolling out knowledge across a wider portfolio. And it can also be looking at the behaviours within a building, which is then going to be rolled out to a new building if you're moving towards a new location. So each of those will then have levers which will pull on the top 4 areas. And the top 4 starts to look very much at some of the key areas within the building. So if your focus is towards user satisfaction, you want to understand the occupant satisfaction, but you also perhaps want to understand a bit about the survey and their forensics as well. If you focus very much towards cost savings, it's more around the first 3 areas that you're looking at. So as a collective, this starts asking questions about what was the original design intent of the building and how was the building originally created for its performance and energy consumption. Then looking at what the data is, looking at a walkthrough of how people use the building. Are there any doors that are open that should really be closed? Are set points being correctly administered and adhered to throughout the building? Are the start times, shutdown times of the operations actually in line with what the BMS is saying? And that gives you that accuracy, that granularity of the behaviour of the building as well. And then finally, that occupant satisfaction. How do people respond as well within the building? So all of that knowledge helps to be able to understand how a building is best identified to operate and perform, and then what you can do from an organisation and having the occupants within the building to be able to deliver what's right for the organisation. I mentioned at the beginning about the Innovate UK programme, and there's a initial report which came out in January 2016. It's about 10 years or so of research that came out. What was eye-opening to me and enlightening to me is these are still some of the same issues that I was identifying some 20 years ago, and that colleagues that have spoken about the built environment have been talking about from the 1980s. So whilst there's a lot that's happened, there's a lot where we haven't really moved too much further on as well. So all of this information is still hugely valuable and valid for today's buildings. And the 3 key things which they came up with was technology, BMS and metering, and also the delivery and the processes. What I would suggest is do have a look at the reports and capture the details and the information which is in there. There's lots of recommendations that can be taken on board. Simple things like the technology is great, but if it's not communicated throughout the design stage and then into the operation stage, we fail to understand the benefits that can come through from that technology. So it's only as good as the knowledge transfer that takes place as part of the process. And within that, we've ended up with a number of recommendations that have come through. So hours of operation and the controls and the BMS systems, typically these are set up as design standards when buildings are handed over or when you have major changes that takes place. None of them are geared towards the way that the building operates in the way that you would like it to operate, because that needs to come from the organisation themselves and the changes within it. So I've been and visited, probably getting towards 1,000 building management systems in my time. A large number of them are still in design standards and design settings, even 10, 15 years after they've been installed and they've had regular 6-month reviews and checkups. They're still put into design standards, which means that they are consuming significantly more energy than they need to be. So there's a part of here about making sure it's not just the hours of operation, but all other parts is set up for the way that the building is operating and performing. And now that we've changed the way that buildings operate due to hybrid working post-COVID, again, there's a need for a complete overview of how those controls and systems are set up. We look at the commissioning and the location and where submeters are being placed. Going back to the example which I made or showed earlier on, it's also about understanding, is the submeters telling us the information that we want to understand about how the building performs? If not, they can be moved and they can be shifted to different locations as well to give us a better understanding. Same with the commissioning side. There's a big push around having continuous commissioning, or at least a regular commissioning program. Again, it's about making sure that the building is aligned with the way that the systems are set up. Simple elements around windows, lighting. Is lights on when they need to be on? The images that are here are from a BREEAM outstanding building, but the lights that are here are fused in and are permanently on. So there isn't an ability of being able to take those lights out, even though we have full daylight that's coming in, and there's no real purpose for having the lights on at some times during the day. So it's just about understanding where we have the right lighting levels, but also challenging some of the design solutions that are put in around how lighting should operate. And some elements around fabric performance and the systems that are put in place as well. So the images on the right hand side, this came from a school building as part of the BP programme. And within the stairwell here, it was cold, and regardless of the level of temperature that was within the corridors, within the stairwell, it was always cold. A thermographic study then identified that actually behind the wall, which is straight in front of you, there is nothing else. There is just a space of cold air that comes through from outside. So there was no insulation that was put in, there was nothing else to fill the void or the gap in there. So the use of thermographics is really, really useful to be able to understand both the levels of insulation which are in place, but also where there are leakages that occur. I've been involved with other organisations that have used it, and it's been hugely beneficial, particularly for things like sealing up windows and avoiding leakages there as well. And I've mentioned already about innovative systems and the challenges. So there's nothing wrong about innovative systems being installed, but it does require a different level of conversation and knowledge transfer as you move through from design into the delivery and the knowledge transfer into the operations for those systems to work in line with how the building operates and the behaviours and the culture that exists within the building. So those elements need to be understood first before you identify whether the innovative system can help and support you as well. So just some examples of what has happened and some experiences from organisations that have implemented some of the findings from this exercise. So from Boots, where they went through an exercise of recommissioning stores, the set points and the operating hours to manage occupancy, something which is normally expected to be done as per standard. They naturally do extend out. Boots saved 7 to 11% across their stores by maintaining a tighter scope on set points and operating hours. John Lewis Partnerships recommissioned their HVAC and their control systems, and have also gone into a continuous commissioning exercise now. Again, about 10% savings from that commission exercise. And at 201 Bishopsgate, which was, I believe, a British land building, using the BMS, the sub-metering, and actually going through from both the top down and the bottom up of the data, helped them to understand how energy was being consumed, but also led on to modifications within the BMS, and that led to a 20% reduction of building electricity consumption. So again, all of these are the examples of what we've spoken about: understanding the data, understanding what it's telling us, the orders, and then going through with resetting or realigning the building performance and the systems and control strategies that are in place. Thank you very much for that. So that was the quick run through of the good practice guides. Sophie, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Sunil. And if I can please bring in Laura and Neil for the discussion. And just to remind the audience, please do put your questions in the Q&A box, which you will see at the bottom of your screen. I just want to open up a question to the panel, really around FM's role. And FMs clearly understand the value they can bring to net zero plans, especially when it comes to managing the energy efficiency and optimizing workplaces. So that's clear. But given this is a key area of expertise, how do you think we can close the gap between intent and action? How can we remove the barriers to actually deliver on the action needed? Sunil and Neil, can I start with you, please?
Yeah. Neil, did you want to take that first?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, for me, I think that, well, back to Neil's first point, really, the data is everything to the facilities manager. I think there's a danger, as Sunil highlighted, that when you start on this, you think you haven't got enough data, and therefore you go quite data heavy rather than creating some action. And I think, as Sunil showed in the slides in the best practice guide, you have systems in place, you have data in place, so probably start with something simple that you can really latch onto, grow confidence with. And with confidence, we all tend not to need as much data. When we're not confident, we need more data. I think that's true in most things in our life. And with energy, there's a real danger to get into the detail too quickly.
Yeah. I think certainly there is a lot of this is about decision making. So the data enables us to make decisions. And for the decision making, there's part from an FM side where we do need to get better at how we write business cases and document things and put them forward. But there's also an education that's needed from the senior management team that buildings aren't very simple plug and play options. You know, the culture and the behaviours of the many people, the customers that we have working within the buildings, means that some solutions will work and some won't work, and that's down to the way that the organisation operates. So there's also a role of FM educating senior managers about the culture and providing that framework of what can work and what can't work. So yes, decisions should be made by senior managers, but they do need the guardrails around what can and can't take place.
Thank you. Laura, some of the issues that came to the fore, including to the fabric, central to many of the energy efficiency issues is the building gap. What tends to be the biggest obstacle really to optimizing building performance?
Well, we know from the BP programme that Sunil's already mentioned that the performance gap arises in four main areas. One is the modelling during the design. The next is specification changes before the building is completed, either changes to the design which are modelled or decisions being changed during construction. Often there's the commissioning can be a problem, so it's either rushed or incomplete. And then the last one is unanticipated occupant behaviour. And I think that individuals who have an ongoing relationship with the building are those who are best placed to deal with all of those things, because they can understand the building better. So regardless of the design intent, what have they actually got? What are they actually dealing with? And that goes to do with all the specification as well. And then understanding how everything is commissioned and being able to tweak it. And obviously, data is always going to be key to understanding what's really going on. And also it's still key when you're thinking about the occupants and their behaviour and their needs, which of course may well have changed since the building was designed anyway, especially post-COVID, or it may be going through a period of change. So it's people who can engage with the building and engage with the occupants to find out what they're really dealing with. And I think there are real opportunities there to narrow that performance gap.
Thank you. Well, going slightly back to the post-occupancy evaluation, that is obviously, well, I would say that from an operational readiness perspective, we would always advocate FMs to be very much part of that original design brief, etc., so that we can make sure that ultimately the building will be able to deliver on the use. But post-occupancy evaluations often don't take place. Now, Sunil, you talked about the methodology. How often do you think that should actually take place, an audit like that, and when would be the best time to do it?
Yeah. So there's a variety of elements. I mean, certainly within the first 2 years of a major change that's happened within a building. So that doesn't necessarily have to be new build. It can be also major changes from a building regulations perspective. That's typically 10% of change, floor area change, or changes in heating, cooling systems, and so on. Because at that point, what you're trying to understand is the system working as effectively and efficiently as possible? And so over those 2 years, there's an element of data collection, there's an element of fine tuning and tweaking, constant commissioning, but ultimately there's also a stage of saying, how is this going to work? And what level of engagement within the other stakeholders do we need to take place? After that, a lot of this is about linking up with other parts that also Laura's mentioned. So that continuous commissioning piece might become more of an important factor. The employee engagement and awareness can be fed through into annual surveys of staff. The regular reviews of the data and information is going to be needed as part of your annual reporting that takes place. So there's a number of these factors that can be fed in as part of business as usual programs and activities, but they take place in 4 or 5 different strands. So the role then for an FM side is, how do we pull those bits together? The data points already exist through multiple different areas. How do we pull it together so that we can then provide an informed decision from that data set?
Thank you. Neil, do you have some considerations and thoughts to add to that point? Or?
No, I think that was pretty good. So Neil sort of nailed it. I think there is just many stakeholders. I think the one that I'm seeing emerging that's probably not the threat to the FM, but you've got to get early adoption, is the IT departments. Now that's one that I think is very new, and it just shows how that continual evaluation and understanding. I think where procurement and capital planning sits, and most organisations understand those bits, but the IT consideration on data security is a new piece that just shows, as Neil said, you've got to be quite thorough in understanding where the objectives are coming from and who's sitting behind the business.
Neil, thank you. That's a beautiful segue into the next question, really, around ownership and possibly at times the lack of awareness around who's responsible for carbon and energy at more senior levels, so that FMs can achieve their objectives in this area. Can you really talk a little bit more about who are the key stakeholders? How can FMs tackle that lack of awareness and ownership?
Yeah, so I think, forgive me for using marketing as an example, I think carbon has become the new marketing, that we all sort of know what it isn't to us, but we don't really know what it is to us in terms of how we report. And every senior manager in every business will say climate change, carbon, energy, is a really important strategic objective. They don't really understand how that applies to their business, and they don't really understand how they can do something about it. So the facilities manager, to me, becomes the absolute centre of that discussion if they can explain what the buildings are using and try and keep the narrative around what we call scope 1 and scope 2, the things that they're actually impacting in the building. And I think if the facilities manager starts to, the finance director, as Sir Neil's mentioned earlier brilliantly, you've got streamlined energy carbon reporting, you've got ESOS, you've got various compliance reporting that are sitting in the finance department. So the first relationship I think the facilities manager has to form on this is with the finance person. The finance person really needs to engage in that discussion around the long term. Then you've got the landlords where it applies. Then you've got the supply chain managers. And by supply chain, I mean the people that are buying energy, not the supply chain into energy. I think there's still a very big disconnect between who's buying energy and who's managing energy. And you need to that's a stakeholder that you really have to get on board, because if your return on investments are being calculated against X and actually you've been procured at Y, it becomes a very difficult conversation. The number one thing that switches the finance director off is when the numbers don't stack up. They don't mind if the numbers are incorrect, but if they've been shown one thing and then it's another, confidence goes. And as I say, the last one for me is now the IT cybersecurity threat or perceived threat alongside data security. So I'd almost run it in that order. If you've got finance next to you, trusting you, they'll guide you on the numbers. And then if you've got procurement with you, that massively helps.
Laura, Sunil, do you have any further thoughts?
I suppose I think the importance of data is finding the right data to communicate with the right person, and if you have the right tools to help interpret, take data from raw data into information and then knowledge and action, that's what's really important. There's also, I think, since that 2016 report was written and researched, there's a lot more data available. There's a lot of more sensors, there's built-in sensors in devices. It could be possible to, I think it's already mentioned, be overwhelmed with it. But now we're seeing, what we're starting to fund are more tools that are using very clever data science and AI to produce more meaningful results. And I'm hoping that in the next few years that some of the projects we're funding will become useful to your members.
Thank you, Laura. I guess there's a lot of talk about the overwhelming of data, and your point speaks to that. Typically, can we be brief about what the data is that FMs should actually be focusing on? Because you mentioned some of the tools that collect the data, but what is the key data that you would like to see FMs focus on?
So I think from my side, there's a couple of elements in here. You've got a top line of energy that's being consumed. So the main forms that we're looking at for reporting purposes is typically the energy uses. That would be the gas, the electricity, the diesel, kerosene, or any other related fuel supplies. Might be district schemes as well that comes in there, but also some of the travel options as well. So company cars and any other company vehicles, and also business travel. So that relates to the SECR and the ESOS reporting activities. Together with things like refrigerant gases that would be used, that covers you for the scope 1 and scope 2 reporting activities also. So the key parts of that is just understanding the data, and for the vast majority you want 2 data points to be able to validate the information. So metered information together with also energy bills information will give you some form of validation of that data. And then you can look at external validation of the data as well, particularly because this information needs to be publicly reported and your directors are going to need to sign off on it. So that's your top line information that allows for reporting over a period of 3 years and trends, and that data being available month by month can give you some useful insights about how changes have happened. Below that, you then want to have information which is based upon the key parts within your building. So if you're in a multi-tenanted building and you have a floor, within the floor you have the electricity, your service charge then includes the rest of your provision. Within that floor you may have a computer room, and then you may also have other space that's provided. So you may wish to sub-meter your comms room or your data room to be able to understand how energy is consumed within that space, and then also looking at it from the rest of the floor plate as well. So we've done exercises beforehand where we've done modelling through half-hour data and meter data of just turning all of the sockets off over the weekend. So instead of computer systems, etc., being left on standby, if you turned everything off, what would that look like? And because the data is all available through your half-hour metered supply, you can get a very good idea of what savings can be achieved if you turned off standby equipment out of hours. So you've got those sorts of exercises which can also help hugely with the it's the behaviours. It's about understanding why the energy is being used and how the energy is being used. So you've got your top line. Below that, you want to understand the hows and the whys. There isn't as such a silver bullet. It's about really going to get to grips with what's your key areas of consumption, the key activities that you want to focus upon, and then digging into the detail of that.
Thank you, Sunil. Now, before I bring Neil back into the conversation, I did briefly want to go back to Laura, because Laura, you talked about some of the work that you're doing around turning data into an actionable tool and that more information. Is there anything more you want to share about what you're doing in that area?
Well, I'll mention too. So our program is really a retrofit program. We need to make buildings more efficient so that we can support electrification of heat. We're using most of the projects we're supporting are really looking at using data to inform decision making around retrofit. Most of them are actually in the domestic space, but we have some which are focused on non-domestic. So, for example, one is actually focused on historic buildings and is currently working with the Diocese of Sheffield. So they're monitoring a huge number of churches. But the thing that's interesting, I think, that they're doing is they're really looking at behaviour and occupancy in buildings. So I think that's quite an important thing, that their particular software won't be relevant to everyone, but they're really using that data to show the users of those buildings what they need from their buildings. They really had no idea. Obviously, a lot of churches are quite chilly, but they also don't have funding to put the heating on all the time. So there's a really interesting bit there about understanding the occupant behaviour as well as the environment. They're also looking at the indoor environment quality. So obviously mold and damp can be a problem in these buildings. So it's just that I think that's interesting, bringing lots of data together, and then they have a platform where the users of those buildings are able to understand. So they're very much dealing with users of buildings. Another project we're supporting is looking at portfolios of buildings, but non-domestic buildings, and the decarbonisation across a portfolio. And that means that they're looking at all the buildings and then they're building an enormous database of systems that could be put into those buildings. And they're able to produce menus of pathways for decarbonisation, which will include lots of different renewable options, how they will interact with the building, how they will interact with each other, and what that means for the value of the asset and the quality of the assets on a relatively long-term basis. And they're finding that that's really helpful to those looking to understand how they should invest in those buildings. Yeah, I think they were the two main projects that I wanted to highlight because I think they're doing interesting and different things that could support ongoing high quality buildings with good energy efficiency.
Brilliant. We'll talk about refurb, refits, and refocusing towards renewables a little bit later. But Neil, I wanted to come back to you because you obviously help your clients, partners with achieving better energy management. So how do you think clients can better leverage their partnerships, such as yourself, to get the right data?
Well, initially find out what data they've got. I think there's often a case that there's data that exists that people don't know they've got. So, for example, your utility provider on any large building will have meter level data often to a half-hourly level. So one of the first questions I ask the client to ask the utility provider, if they haven't got it directly, what's the best day? What's the worst day of energy usage in the last 12 months? And can you explain why that one was good and that one wasn't so good? And that just helps people get a little comfortable with it. Then they start to ask their cleaners, their security operations, what they do, how they operate. So for me, I think, yeah, the start is understanding what have you got available to you, how useful is it, and I think the terms change slightly. But if you're looking for green wardens or people like that, I always say to people, ask your team and see who leans forward. Don't sort of delegate it to someone. Look who in the room leans forward when you start to talk about data and energy and performance and shows an interest, and that could be from any department. And so for me, the number one thing is find out why you're using things differently, what data is available to you, and then who in your team, supply chain included, is actually engaged in actually wanting to help. And then you can look for specialists like ourselves to come and engage in the deeper subjects. But there's a lot you can do to start with, just through contacting your utility provider, talking to your team, and really finding some people that are interested. Brilliant.
Thank you for that. Going back to our sustainability survey, the report of which we launched in February, one of the areas of weakness in energy management plans that we saw is moving with technology. And the sustainability survey showed that FMs recognize that there is a lack of understanding of the technology that's needed. Obviously, the guidance talks a lot about the different technologies that you need to use. There appears to be a gap between the technology that is available for FMs and the use of that technology by FMs. What do you think is the problem?
So I think there's a number of areas to look at here. So one of them is around whether the technology is the right technology to be used as well. So I made a comment earlier on about behaviours and cultures within organisations, and a really good example is lots of businesses during 10 or so years ago went and installed biomass boilers as heat sources, and those were installed. In many cases, they weren't installed using heat storage. So it was effectively an instantaneous provision of power from the biomass boiler, and any excess was then wasted and had to be dumped. That effectively leads to that biomass system being ineffective and too costly to maintain. So the value of that would have been able to understand the sizing, but also how big your heat storage would be needed before you can then start to use it. Another example would be with older technologies of combined heat and power units, the small scale units that are used in small buildings. We did an exercise with an organisation where they were installed incorrectly because the inlet and the outlet valves were put the wrong way around by the installers. We ended up bringing the manufacturer in to review and revise. And a lot of that was also because the installation capacity, the skills level to install wasn't quite there. So some of the gaps that we've got around the technology is both the specification, the sizing of whether the technology is effective or not effective. We've got elements around how they're being installed, commissioned, and has that happened correctly for the way that the building's going to be used. And then we've also got an element is the units being used correctly. In most cases, that there is valid and useful technology that can be implemented, but there's a lot of these problems that come through with the specifications, with the commissioning, which can lead to failures. And it's very easy to blame technology as a result of that for being the reason why something has failed, rather than some of the surrounding elements as well.
Thank you, Sunil. I do want to bring in Laura at this point, because I know that you're doing a bit of work around the issue of systems not really talking to each other. Can you talk a bit more to that point?
Yes, so following 2016 and the BP work, UKRI has funded work to try and help data become more robust and interoperable and reusable. So the idea that more data should be shared. So for example, we funded the Active Building Centre, and their work was about buildings working as a system. And I think that's where there's a lot of opportunity. But in order to do that, they have to be able to talk to each other. And so the Active Building Centre produced a set of tools which are about data naming and protocols and ontology. So that's something that we would promote, the using of shared ontologies for data so that systems can talk to each other. And I think that could be useful within a building, but also, as I said, starting to see buildings as part of a system.
Thank you. I would like to move to the topic of managing the energy price risk, and what really, in light of that, and frankly, pricing is not going to change probably for the foreseeable future. So you need to start looking at that as part of the ongoing risk management. What should the decarbonisation pathways for building look like? And the question really focuses on things like deep refit, refurbishment, refocus towards renewable. Neil, what are you seeing with your clients around what do they want? What is happening in the market towards this option? And if you're not seeing it, why not?
I think there was, coming out of COVID and lockdown, there was real appetite for net zero and sort of the bigger picture. Now we've sort of seen much more a refocus back because of price on short-term quick win, evaluation and execution. At first that felt quite depressing, but actually when it's successful, it actually leads to momentum and a bigger conversation. So I think there's sort of, I describe it now as cash, kilowatts and carbon, sort of quite brazenly. So as in, we're here to help you save some cash, as in switch some stuff off. We're here to help you save some kilowatts, as in change your light fittings. We're here to help you save some carbon, as in change the heat source. And I think if you sort of start to put them into sections around longer term, medium term, short term, then I think the business appetite, and I think with all things facilities management, we tend to celebrate success because there's always someone that's too hot, too cold, or a cleaner hasn't done so. There's always an issue that contextually seems to get the facilities manager to not feel confident to present the success in a bigger project. And I think what we've seen is a real focus back onto sort of the near-term projects, but actually trying to promote that they go and celebrate success and create momentum and keep the business as usual activities in context against those good things they've done.
Okay. Sunil, what are you seeing happening in the market from your perspective?
So the loss of the work that we're doing is around developing scope 1 and 2 inventories, scope 3 inventories as well, and also looking at longer term plans. So looking at when carbon neutrality or net zero can be positioned, reaching out from now until 2030 to 2050. A lot of the data and the information that we have moves forward in terms of key timelines of when changes can take place. So a lot of this, as Laura's mentioned, is about you'll get to points where a significant change around electrification of heat will be needed, or decisions around how comms rooms are going to be set up, or how you purchase for your energy through on-site renewables or other agreements. And it's providing the confidence of the organisation to be able to make those decisions. So there's a large part building on from what Neil was saying as well, which is around how do we utilise a lot of this knowledge and information, how do we work with the finance team so that there is confidence that if we're talking about completely changing the heat system in 3 or 4 years' time, the business is thinking strategically about how that's going to happen and what that means for the organisation, because without it, you can't meet some of your forward targets and requirements and commitments. But also to make that change is a massive gamble for the finance department and for others, because you may have those individuals that are upset, or some of the other delivery mechanisms may not work out. So FM's role is about also providing the confidence to the management team that it's the right decision to be made.
Okay, thank you. There is something around the long-term impact of not pursuing decarbonisation pathways that I would like to quickly ask Laura about, because what is going to be the impact of things like financial valuation for future stranded assets? Do you have some thoughts around that valuation impact starting to show in the UK?
Yeah, so I mentioned the project we're supporting, a company called Quantico. That's exactly the kind of thing they're looking at. So they're looking at, if you want to start retrofitting your building with renewables or net, zero carbon heat, which are suitable for that building, but they're also looking on the impact of the value of the building, and they're speaking to investors who care about their scope 3 emissions, and that will be the emissions from your building. So if you could, so it's quite a complicated model, but because they're able to use clever data science and AI, they're able to do this work through a lot of different scenarios to find out what is going to suit your building or your portfolio of buildings. And they're actually, one of the things that we asked them to do is to be able to produce a menu, because then once you have a menu of options, you can then take into account the occupants, which we know are a really important part of there's not one solution, you have to take into account the people there as well. And I also just wanted to back Neil up a bit on the different approaches, because in the domestic sector, we're definitely seeing, there's been a lot of conversation recently about fabric first. So it was always fabric first. Let's get the building really efficient. But I think there's a growing understanding that isn't always appropriate, and that sometimes you need to decarbonise the heat, being conscious that you also want to bring bills down and save bring the energy use down as well. But there's something about that, maybe that's those renewables, that new technology coming in that can inspire other change. You make some wins rather than laboriously trying to make the building as perfect as possible, the building itself, and then actually there being inertia because it's too difficult. So something about some kind of early quick wins and as you say, celebrating those that can then inspire other action.
Thank you. There was something you said prompted me to think of one of the questions from David Kerry on whether the panel can comment on the viability of DSM, demand side management, as a strategic policy to enable commercial and domestic energy savings as a primary effective methodology. Thoughts from the panel?
So as in being able to receive and send energy back to the grid based on the grid performance. So Germany, it's very established. Germany's got a lot of wind, it has a lot of industry, and it's a very sensible model. So effectively, when the wind turbines are turning, there's too much capacity, so they ask for people to take it. And when the wind turbines aren't turning, they're asking people to reduce their energy. In the UK, there are examples where it could work. For most people within the facilities management arena, it possibly isn't the first place to start. It's quite a complex model. I'm aware of a good example of where it does work is I'm aware of a tomato and pepper farmer who's got large greenhouses that need the lights on. Do the peppers and tomatoes care if those lights are on at 12 at night or 12 in the afternoon? No, they don't. That demand side frequency response is very good for there. There's been a lot of talk about, I know, in retail or commercial fittings, the defrost cycles of lots and lots of fridges. It's very complex. If you're not able yet to control your lights, I wouldn't say you'd be able to put all your assets onto a wholesale defrost cycle synced with the grid. So it's a good idea, and it's more once the grid matures than the buildings, would be my view.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm very mindful of time and I have many more questions, but I am going to do the courtesy of sharing James's question before we draw to a close, because he picked on something that I think you must have mentioned, Sunil, in your presentation around the requirement for mandatory reporting of energy usage data, which was mentioned, but they missed how it is likely to be implemented and what will be done with it. Is there an opportunity for a short answer or a follow-up in writing?
Yeah. So, I mean, the short answer is there's the SECR regulation, Simplified Energy and Carbon Reporting, has been in place since 2019, I believe. That's an annual reporting as part of the annual accounts, which is submitted by your finance team. And that's your energy use and also your business travel. That data has to be produced along with metrics and also changes. We also have the ESOS reporting, which is every 4 years, and that requires auditing of consumption by a lead assessor, and that needs to be submitted directly to the regulator. The deadline for this phase is the 5th of June 2024, so it's a few weeks away. And there is a direct alignment between the SECR reporting and the ESOS reporting. And then there will be a new requirements for sustainable disclosure standards. And the details of that will be released hopefully sometime July and August this year.
Thank you for that. And if anyone else wants to know more about those different schemes, they are also referenced in the guidance document. The slides will be circulated, so you can get the QR code of the guidance document, or it is available on our website. I am going to have to leave it there and really thank Sunil, Laura and Neil, and really thank you to the listeners as well. A recording will be available for anyone who wants to listen again and share with a friend. I have to give special thanks as well to Carbon Numbers, because through their support it was possible to update this guidance piece, and it's such a critical piece of information. So thank you, Carbon Numbers. Their details are available in the chat. And thank you as well to our webinar support team, Lucy and Kaya, for supporting us on this particular episode. Thank you all, and hopefully see you again next week when we do an episode around EDI and what you need to do to make it more equitable in our organizations. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.